Hi, I'm Max Bergman.
And I'm Donatien Rui.
And this is The Eurofile, a podcast where we look at Europe through a Washington lens.
Welcome to another episode of The Eurofile. Today, we're going to discuss some recent comments that EU Defense Commissioner Andrius Kubilius made about the creation of a European Standing Army. And then we'll turn to a conversation with Michael Kaufman, Senior Fellow in the Russia and Eurasia Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, about Europe's role in the war in Ukraine. This is a defense-heavy episode, but we haven't done that in a while, so that's pretty exciting. We hope you enjoy the show. All right, Max, big start to 2026. There's a lot going on. And of course, in Europe, there's a lot of conversations, primarily about Greenland, but also about Venezuela, but on the whole is really about the reliability of their closest partner, the United States, with all the conversations around Greenland in particular and Denmark, etc. So in this context, EU Defense Commissioner Kubilius gave a big speech in Sweden about Europe under pressure, and he made some interesting remarks around what he thinks Europe should do, at least on the defense side. Can you walk us through that?
Yeah, so I think this is a really important speech. Kubilius is the former Lithuanian prime minister, so from a Baltic country, very aware of the Russia threat. And Lithuania and all the Baltic states had, historically been EU skeptical isn't really the right way to put it, but they were very much NATO first, right? They wanted to be part of NATO, and anything that would sort of made the United States unhappy or the EU trying to infringe upon NATO, if the US called them, they would, pick up the phone or pick up the veto and say, no, the EU shouldn't do that. And so I think it's really interesting. We have two Baltic or former leaders of their countries, Kubilius and Kaja Kallas, that are leading kind of the EU foreign policy. And with Kubilius, he's the EU Defense Commissioner, very new role. What they've done over the first year is plow ahead with this SAFE program, 150 billion euro loan that's really focused on armaments, right? This is the EU focused on, okay, NATO doesn't really do this. No one's coordinating how Europeans are spending all this money. EU is going to step in and going to incentivize countries to cooperate. And it looks like they've done a really great job. First year, huge amount of countries involved, and we are still waiting to kind of see the results of this, but everyone is sort of subscribed to this. But what's important, I think, about this speech is it kind of represents a pivot. It's saying, look, we're not sure we can rely on the United States. The United States is, looking to Asia, looking to its hemisphere. It's telling Europe to pick up the slack. But that requires us to do a lot more, us as Europeans, to do a lot more than just spend together. And he's starting to outline, look, the threat from Russia is very real. And he proposes 100,000 strong European force, European army, and is really, I think, in some ways crossed a threshold in pushing the envelope and saying about the European army discussion. This is something we had called for in a report in October, how Europe can defend itself with less America, where we also call for 100,000 strong force. And that number is largely to replace the US troops that are currently in Europe. But what is important here is to start really poking the kind of national sovereignty. We have to have our own little distinct bonsai armies, as he described it, and begin to integrate. And I think this is the sort of bold thinking that Europeans need to really approach European defense with fresh eyes. And that's what I think is really comes across here.
It's interesting. I feel like it's similar to other times where an idea like this started in academic conversation and think tank conversations, and you see it slowly start to pick up in the actual policy debate in Brussels, across the continent. And all of a sudden, it's a real conversation that they're having. And that's exactly what needs to happen right now.
Right. I mean, I think people need to understand how change happens in Europe, but also in all democracies. Starts oftentimes very slowly. I mean, the reason why think tanks exist, right, is that they come up with ideas, they try to throw out ideas, and then those ideas get sort of garbled up or get sort of put into the wash, into the blob of whatever. And they begin to shift a little bit, but then more and more people begin to adopt it. And that's sort of what we saw, I think, with Eurobonds. It was like multi-year discussion effort. Didn't really start on the defense side, actually started way back with the Hamiltonian moment being discussed, the need for fiscal union. And that came to a head during COVID with Next Gen EU. Then how do you extend this? Germans saying it's a one-off, but then now making a concession. So I think what we're beginning to see here is the EU is focused on whatever Europeans need it to be focused on. The EU is not simply an economic project or a peace project. The EU is what the Europeans need it to be. And right now, especially with the US sort of being really unreliable, Europeans need it to become a security actor. And it's got its nose under a tent and it's looking at European security. And it's like, oh my God, we have real problems. And that's reflected in the report and also in the conversation we're about to have with Mike Hoffman. One thing that I think he raises, Kubilius, which I think is very important, because we've been talking a lot about defense on the show at CSIS, but he also calls for a European Security Council. And I think this is also very important because you really see this in Europe right now, where to me, Europe is actually very aligned, very unified on foreign policy. It's almost, European leaders are all basically saying exactly the same thing. But when everyone tweets, when everyone says exactly the same thing at the same time, you kind of don't hear it because it sort of drowns each other out. And sometimes you need a singular voice. And there's a new call from Giorgia Meloni as well as Emmanuel Macron say maybe Europeans need to start engaging with Russia. This is sort of distinct from the Security Council proposal. But I think the challenge is who does it, right? Who is going to pick up the phone to Vladimir Putin? The Italians are saying maybe Mario Draghi should do it as sort of Europe's Mr. Fix-It. Alexander Stubb, the Finnish president, has put himself forward. And Kaja Kallas, I think, wants it to be her, but like she's not really the right interlocutor with Russia, just given how she's talked about Russia, which I don't necessarily disagree with, but it's not the most diplomatic language, and I don't think the Russians would probably pick up the phone. So I think Europe right now is grappling both on the defense side, but now we're seeing it on the foreign policy side as well.
That's an interesting point also related to Kallas is something like a special envoy for Ukraine and Russia is an interesting like embryo of a unified foreign policy position that could be pursued by one person. And that would be the lightning rod for decisions that are being made upstream but communicated more clearly. I understand Kallas as a particular actor in this space, but isn't that supposed to be the role of the HRVP, is to be that singular voice on foreign policy? And do you see potential issues or really benefits in almost like duplicating some of those roles?
So, I mean, I think ideally, yes, you have an HRVP, the High Representative Vice President for Foreign Policy and Security, or for whatever the title is. It was supposed to be the EU Foreign Minister. But then, like, the Brits had like an aneurysm about that in negotiations. At least that's my understanding.
Well, now instead they have a defense minister, basically.
Yeah, because they just like created it. So, but look, what I would say is that in the U.S. system, the Secretary of State is not always the lead actor in foreign policy initiatives. And especially when you have as sort of complicated setup as the EU and European states have, I don't think it's a problem to appoint sort of a very senior head of state or former head of state to act as special envoy. You know, during the Iran back channel negotiations, it wasn't really John Kerry that initiated that. There was Bill Burns, who was the deputy secretary of state. Oftentimes, it's not the main actor that then is there in the room. So if I was in Brussels, you know, advising Kallas, I would say, look, someone needs to pick up the phone to the Russians. You're probably not best placed. I think you would have a hard time having that conversation. And I don't actually think it's a big blow to the EU's credibility and clout if it's another EU senior official or former senior official that is acting in this kind of, you know, back channel go-between role. And so to me, I think it's okay. I don't think this is like a big blow or shouldn't be viewed as a big blow to her or the EU if someone else gets chosen as the special envoy for this. And I think it's important that they pick someone instead of it just being Zelensky having like 8 bodyguards of European officials when they show up at the White House. So I think it's time for the EU to move in that direction. And I think that's a good segue to our conversation with Mike Hoffman, which is sort of a really interesting tour de force looking at both where the war is right now between Russia and Ukraine and how Europe is postured. And I think it really reflects a lot of what Kubilius talks about and demonstrates how big a problem is Europe's dependence right now on the U.S. for its security.
We are thrilled to welcome Michael Kaufman to the Eurofile. Michael is a senior fellow in the Russia and Eurasia program of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where he focuses on the Russian military, Ukrainian armed forces, and Eurasian security issues. Aside from his work at Carnegie, Michael is a contributing editor at War on the Rocks, where he hosts the Russia Contingency, a biweekly podcast on the Russian military and the Russia-Ukraine war. Michael, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on your podcast.
So it's early 2026. We are approaching the 4-year commemoration of the start of the war. So let's start with the big picture. How would you characterize the current state of the war in Ukraine? And what are some of the key dynamics on the ground that are different from a year ago even?
Sure. Well, typically during the winter from late December till about February, there's a bit of a slowdown in offensive intensity in the war, and it normally picks back up during March, although much of the fighting can be characterized as attritional and positional in nature. That's been the general dynamic for the past almost 2 years. In 2025, the main kind of tactical evolution, if you look at the fighting on the ground, was Ukraine focused on zone defense with drones, compensating for Russian advantages in material and manpower. There was a big tug of war between the Russian and Ukrainian armed forces over the drone engagement zone, because that dictates initiative on the ground and freedom of action. It started out squarely over the Russian forces. This is basically the ability of drones to engage effectively opposing enemy forces in depths of 20 to 25 kilometers from the forward line of troops. But over the course of the period, through a series of adaptations, the Russian military shifted more over the Ukrainian armed forces, so there became kind of close to a general parity between the two of them in drone employment, with different advantages on the Ukrainian and the Russian side in tactics and technology. And the Russian military is prosecuting the war primarily through infiltration as a form of maneuver, using dispersed infantry to get through Ukrainian positions, but it made for very costly gains in that the Russian casualties went up significantly relative to the amount of terrain that they took. It's fair to say they took maybe 30% more territory last year in 2025 than they did in 2024, but at considerably higher costs. And overall, it was a much better year for Ukraine than expected. That said, this is a very difficult winter, because this winter is not only colder than the previous two, but the Russian strike campaign against Ukrainian energy infrastructure and gas, which is quite important for home heating, has had an impact, and you see a lot of rationing in Ukrainian cities, a lot of shortages of electricity, of other types of critical infrastructure for that's relevant to maintaining the civilian population. And so it is going to be a very challenging winter, and we are just getting into it because it's early January. It's going to be quite cold in January and February. So there's the second aspect to this war, which is the respective strike campaigns between the two countries. And we've seen considerable escalation in 2025 with unrestricted warfare between Russia and Ukraine. Ukraine going after Russian shipping in the Black Sea and outside of the Black Sea. Russia going after Ukrainian shipping, Ukrainian ports, and Ukrainian critical infrastructure as well. And so there's a degree of kind of escalation from both sides, given not the relative deadlock, but nonetheless the inability of either side to establish any sort of decisive advantage on the battlefield.
Mike, I want to maybe ask one more Ukraine-related question and then get into kind of how you see Europe, Russia from a military perspective. But it seems to me 2025, one of the big things that happened is that the Europeans began to take over the financing of the war for Ukraine. We've seen the Europeans sort of step up through NATO, buying American weapons, essentially buying American military aid to then transfer to Ukraine. And at the end of this year, there's, a lot of back and forth in the way European politics work about reparations loan, about how Europe was going to finance Ukraine. They ended up getting there, issued Eurobonds, something we on this podcast have been calling for a long time. But it looks like Europe is providing the money now for Ukraine. But 2026 is also a year when I think U.S. weapons deliveries are probably going to decline pretty precipitously. That's at least my read. All that money was paid for during the Biden administration. It's sort of hard to know when things come off the factories. And so I'm curious for your take on that. But how do you see 2026 unfolding? Is Europe in the right place to sort of take the baton from the U.S.? Or do you see the potential for the baton being dropped as it's sort of being handed off to the Europeans?
So on Ukraine, I think that with the creation of Pearl last year, the initiative to enable Europeans to buy U.S. production and to buy what used to be paid for as PDA, Presidential Drawdown Authority, as things from U.S. stocks, that we basically have a mechanism for Europeans to provide capabilities that can only be provided by the United States by purchasing them from us. On top of that, we also have FMS. The big question is, to what extent will the Trump administration make those available, since we saw fairly early on folks like Rich Colby and others wanting to constrain the provision of certain types of munitions to Ukraine on the basis of readiness concerns and prioritization interest, that is prioritizing us for these capabilities for other theaters.
Just a quick plug for our Russian Roulette podcast, where we talked to Adam Entos of the New York Times that did sort of a behind the scenes story of the Pentagon trying to hold back stuff to Ukraine. But yes, Go ahead.
Yeah, it's a good article about it. So the issue of how to pay for it, I think, has largely been solved. I would say that the issuing of Euro bonds, I won't get into those details, it's good that they got there in December after a painful and acrimonious process of trying to convince Belgium to take on the entire risk of using the Russian funds that were being held by Euroclear. And having failed at that, Europeans finally settled on the fact that they will issue Euro bonds, which, I think are largely tied to Germany's ability to take on further debt. But okay, after a while of saying there's no plan B, but failing at plan A, they came up with plan B. And that's a little bit what counts. So they have enough funding, at least, to sustain the war for another year. The big question then remains, is there going to be sufficient munitions availability on the U.S. side, and where U.S. policy is going to go? Because just because you have the money doesn't mean that the Pentagon will sell. But so far, it seems like we are providing, via this Pearl initiative, a lot of things that we would have been providing previously purchased to USAI. So maybe the one area of disagreement I'd have with your initial opening comment is that, yes, it is true that Biden administration last year had programmed in advance a lot of USAI purchases, which is new production, and months of PDA, Presidential Drawdown Authority. And then the Trump administration late in the summer essentially said that those things will have to be paid for by Europeans. But the U.S. is still committed to providing Ukraine with monthly supplies of air defense munitions, artillery ammunition, what have you, that used to be paid for by USAI, but now will be bought by Europeans. As far as leadership goes, the U.S. is not handing over the baton. SACU is still in charge of this in Wiesbaden, Security Assistance Group Ukraine. And SATU, which is kind of the NATO mission alongside it and under it there, is a counterpart operation with certain things that they do. But by and large, this is still being coordinated by the United States. Yes, there's been a greater shift last year to European allies in managing security assistance to Ukraine, but I'm not seeing much of the baton being handed over yet. And to what extent is Europe prepared to take over the baton if the United States somehow bows out? I honestly don't know, because there's certain things the United States provides I don't think European countries are well positioned to provide on their own, because we have to talk about things beyond material assistance. I'm not going to get into that, because you got me to get into that once on the Russian Roulette, Max. Okay, and once is enough.
I think that's a perfect segue. Mike has been a repeated guest on Russian Roulette, where we talk about the Russian military, talk about the war in Ukraine. But we really wanted you on this podcast to kind of talk about the blue side. There's been a lot of talk. And, I think the first sort of overarching question here, there's been a lot of talk, statements from European officials, reports from European intelligence agencies across the spectrum looking at Russian reconstitution. That if, let's just say, Trump magically ends the war in Ukraine tomorrow, there's peace, Russia is reconstituting its military. What do you think the threat is to Europe? And I want to sort of take you back to the 2014 period, at least, when I was in government, and suddenly the US government woke up to, oh my God, there's these NATO countries called the Baltics that Russia's right there. Oh my God, holy crap, what do we do? I want to sort of ask you, what do you see the threat posed by Russia right now to Europe? Is this something that Russia is determined to, in a very short period of time, reconstitute, bring its armies over onto NATO EU soil?
Okay, so first, can I backtrack for 1 minute, Max, and offer a little bit of history, since you took us back to 2014? Right? Yeah. And just briefly, brief moment in the life of defense analysts with specialization on Russian military and aspects of European security. So prior to 2014, nobody cared about the Russian military, pretty much. Okay. And most of the views in the US defense establishment were very dated. They were still views of kind of incompetent, drunken Russian troops from the Chechen wars and fairly poor Russian performance in the Russia-Georgia war. And there wasn't much interest in Russian military reform or military modernization. We were still busy with Iraq, Afghanistan, what have you. Okay. After 2014, right, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and also after 2015, the Russian deployment to Syria, which proved at the time much more successful than people anticipated in terms of Russian policy aims, because they thought they would just fall flat on their face and in any expeditionary operation. Views were being quickly revised, right? There was a much greater concern that, okay, the Russian military actually can do something. It's still not clear what. Then the conversation quickly tilted like a pendulum in another direction. And there was a sort of breathless analysis by Rand that Russia could invade and seize the Baltics very quickly and easily. And they started publishing all these things on the basis of a bunch of war games titled Outgunned, Outnumbered, how NATO is defeated by Russia in the Baltics. You remember this, Max. So suddenly, everybody's looking at the Baltics, everybody's learning terms like the Suwalki Gap, and it seems like NATO is just going to get crushed by 25 Russian battalion tactical groups, right? This was the thinking at the time. And I got into an argument with colleagues at Rand at the time, basically saying that this kind of invasion doesn't make sense. And I think we're making it a little too easy. So I disagreed with that argument. And so for much of this time period, though, there was a reassessment of Russian military capability, the threat it posed. And what had been happening was that I think Russian middle analyst folks with my type of specialization prior to 2014 have been saying, look, Russian military reform and modernization is a real thing and the Russian military is changing. People did not believe this until the Russian annexation of Crimea and the Russian deployment to Syria. Then afterwards, folks not only believed it, but lots of people in U.S. Army and others started really accentuating the Russian threat because suddenly it became very relevant for all sorts of interests that they might have had institutionally. And then Russian military was basically saying, no, let's look at Russians are not 12 feet tall either. Their military is very much a work in progress. There's quite a few things they can't do. And then after we saw the Russian invasion of Ukraine again, the full-scale invasion in 2022, again, the narrative was, you've grossly overestimated the Russian military. Actually, they're 4 feet tall. And that's not what people were saying, were basically saying prior to the invasion. And a few years into that, we are now at the point where you're asking me this question, Max, which is, where are we in the never-ending pendulum swing between Russians are 4 feet tall and 12 feet tall? Okay. And the latest set of war games that either says the Russians are coming and they're going to crush us all and we're outnumbered and outgunned, or the ones that say that we totally have it done and in and out 20-minute adventure. Like we can easily beat Russia. There's some reports even suggesting that. I've even seen one recently implying that Estonia could solo the entire Russian military by itself without a substantial amount of NATO military assistance. I'm doing injustice to the colleagues' argument, but nonetheless, I would say that there's a minority opinion on that subject. So what kind of threat does Russia pose to NATO? Because it's important to convey that, look, as a defense analyst focused on the subject, you're either dealing with Russians are 4 feet tall or 12 feet tall in the conversation, and you're always stuck in the middle trying to right-size the threat, what the Russian military might be able to do, what it can and can't do, and trying to fill in the gaps of knowledge between what Russian force expansion plans are and modernization plans are versus what they're probably going to end up being able to do. And then lastly, the big unknown. What are Europeans going to do? Are they going to actually spend this money on defense modernization? What are they going to buy with it? What will be NATO military capability in this future we are projecting to? So first, briefly, military power doesn't exist in the abstract. It needs a scenario to express itself. It requires a contingency. So when we talk about, the threat Russia poses to Europe, what I think we really have to talk about is what are the potential fights between NATO and Russia? And they take us to a couple places, maybe Baltics, maybe, Russian border with Finland, for example, since Finland has joined NATO. Maybe somewhere else, another contingency, something in the Arctic. That's something a country like Norway would be concerned with. It all depends where you are. But the contingencies really matter because it's very difficult to abstract military power. You have to actually have a scenario. And that's how we do defense planning in the United States. We have defense planning scenarios that we peg the force to, and we say, how do we do in that fight? And if we don't do well, what should our force posture, what should our capabilities be in order to perform much better, to deter that scenario, or to be able to successfully defend if it comes to pass? Okay, with that in mind, I think that the likely contingencies people are using to discuss Russian military threat, right, are either something small and aggressive against a Baltic state, like a bite and hold of some Baltic state territory, which remains a scenario out there. And to be clear, this conversation is separated from intent. Intent is very difficult to predict. Like, if you were like me, who kind of were leading the drumline on the fact that Russia was likely to do a full-scale invasion of Ukraine in fall of 2021, then great. But many folks thought it wasn't going to happen, right? So if you then go from that and say you're 100% confident there will never be a Russian invasion of a Baltic state or a NATO member, you're just so certain of this, you need to have some analytical humility. Intent is not that easy to predict, okay? And so you do have to hedge at least a bit against capability and potential, and also past behavior and the fact that, you know, countries that are led by personalist authoritarian regimes, they also make mistakes and miscalculations, right? This is, at the end of the day, these are interactions between people. So if you look at this likely scenario, yes, the Russian military would be able to do it, not even having to wait for the end of a Russia-Ukraine war. But to me, the scenario I first look at is large-scale combat operations, right? That is, at what point can the Russian military conduct a large-scale invasion of any NATO member that would be very significant, not just to them, but to the entirety of the alliance? And, you know, there's been active debate on that subject, but that debate is a narcissism of small differences. I think at first we thought in 2022 that it would take a decade for the Russian military to recover. If you look at the substantial increase in Russian defense industrial production, at a significant increase of defense spending, which is a secular trend, meaning Russia is going to continue spending a significant percentage of GDP, maybe 7% or so, on defense moving forward. And that's just a sort of official spending. It could be quite higher if you include certain other categories of spending. And if you look at Russian force expansion, the Russian military expanded quite a bit over the course of the Russia-Ukraine war. Then the truth is probably it's going to take them less time to reconstitute the ability to conduct large-scale combat operations against a NATO member, not 10 years, maybe 7 years, maybe 5 or less. NATO seems to have agreed on 3, which I think is the average between the Baltic position of they could do it very soon within a amount. No, sorry. I think NATO agreed on 5, which is the average between the Baltic position of sort of within 3 years. And I think the analytical view of maybe upwards of 7. But bottom line is that anything short of 10 years in defense planning is actually a very, very short timeline. So the difference between 4, 5, 6, 7 years is not a significant years in defense planning. And the Russian military is going to reconstitute faster than folks expect. It has in the past. It's clear if we look both at force expansion, the coming state armament program that they're going to approve in August of this year, defense industrial modernization, expansion of that production capacity, and access to components and munitions from other countries like China and North Korea, that we should probably make a safer bet it's going to go faster. When the Russian military itself will recover to conduct this kind of operation in terms of force quality, I think that'll take them longer when we look at people and the ability of that force to operate differently. But nonetheless, as a defense analyst, you tend to worst case scenario, so you have to bet on the fact that they'll do it sooner. And then the big question is, well, when is NATO going to reconstitute, right? And more importantly, when is NATO actually going to realize a lot of these plans for increased defense spending and force expansion?
Well, you mentioned that at the end of your answer here is what's NATO going to do. So my question then is, what's the European side of that ledger of rearmament efforts? Are you seeing that uptick go fast or fast enough for the kind of scenarios that you just talked about on the Russian side? Are you seeing them fill the gaps that they actually need to fill in terms of military capabilities, both in general and in the event of a Russian threat to other parts of NATO? What's your assessment of this?
Look, if you look at NATO members, yes, there's been significant increase in defense spending. There's been big turnarounds and views on this in countries like Germany. Are they buying the right things, though, is a very good question. And the honest answer is it depends. So when it comes to munitions, in many cases, the answer might be yes. When it comes to expanding force capacity, the answer is no. European militaries remain fairly brittle, especially amongst the what one would consider the larger military powers in Europe, like Britain, France, and others, the reality is that those forces are quite small. NATO retains traditional advantage in air power, in technology, in joint force integration, ability to conduct complex operations at scale, but only with the United States as the enabler, main coordinating force, and organizer. And we might get to that into a bit, because you're asking about the Europeans within NATO. If you're asking, are NATO members buying in large numbers the capabilities the United States provides? The honest answer is not really. Now, good reason for that, because they're very expensive. And if you assume that the United States is still playing the role that it says it's going to play in NATO regional defense plans, which are really the only guidelines we have on the continent right now for procurement. And it's remarkable to me that fairly recently we promulgated these plans. If you looked across a defense budget in NATO, it wasn't really clear what NATO countries had to actually come up with for defense of NATO members until we had these NATO regional defense plans. Yes, there were operational plans that made, use of the existing forces and tried to commit. And there were all these schemes to commit NATO members to some kind of force generation models. Remember, like the 30-30-30 plan for, I can't remember, it was like 30 battalions or 30 ships or something like this. I'm sure you know this. The very, very high readiness joint NATO task force is a very long name that really struggled to convey how ready it was. That really worried me about the actual readiness of partners to deliver on that. Because, like anytime you see something branded a certain way, you begin to worry.
I guess you have to worry about what is not ready. So this one is actually ready to go, but the others, I don't know.
It's very ready. It's like, well, what about the rest of the militaries on the continents? Those are less ready. Those will take you a while. So this task force better do well. But so my general sense of it is that there are big shifts in defense production and in views of what is necessary on the continent. That's the positive side of the story. I think that it remains to be seen if people are going to follow through with this defense spending. Again, one of the big questions, like, okay, are NATO members really concerned enough? Are they concerned enough about the future Russian military? That's the first one, driver one. And driver two, are they concerned enough about the fact that the United States is making clear to them that burden sharing is no longer a conversation, it's a reality, like a looming reality. And it could really be driven home by whatever the U.S. global posture review is that comes out with the Pentagon as well. And if you look at future force reductions in Europe, because the U.S. has prioritized basically homeland defense in the Western Hemisphere, China, Indo-Pacific, and Europe, if you look, U.S. prioritization seems to be coming in as a third, but how distant of a third is a big question mark. I think U.S. remains committed to NATO, but the U.S. is no longer just talking about burden sharing. It's looking seriously for Europeans to take on the bulk of the cost for managing security on their continent. The cost of managing security on the continent is one part of it. Actual management of security is a different part. And this is, Max, where I think it's worth getting into one of my favorite conversations, which is that Excel spreadsheets do not fight. So there is a fair chance that European countries will spend much more on defense, but none of that spending will add up 5 to 10 years from now to the ability to employ European militaries in any large-scale contingency without the United States, for a very simple reason. Over the course of many decades, European militaries amongst NATO members have co-evolved with the U.S. military to essentially plug into the United States Armed Forces, and the U.S. serving as kind of the motherboard that organizes the effort, provides the organizational capacity, logistical capacity, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, and leads the fight and the effort. It's also easier, since we are not a European nation, for us to kind of take the lead. That way, politically, no one has to argue, why was France leading? Why is Germany leading? Why is the UK leading? And also, we have the resources. It's hard to find a European nation that has the resources to provide all of these things on its own to the other ones as well. And the infrastructure is there. And so this is a feature. It's not a bug. It is a feature of European defense that the United States plays a leading role in managing European security. And for all the years that we've complained about Europeans not doing enough, I've often seen the U.S. policy establishment, whenever Europeans are trying to do more, always rushing and saying, no, step back. You don't know how to lead. Let me show you how leadership is done. I will lead you in this. And then unsurprisingly, you don't see Europeans taking on leadership roles. And because of that, Europe is also has an issue of anemic defense spending. And there's often been a bit of acrimony because when the US pushes Europeans to spend more, Europeans don't say, you just want us to buy more American stuff. And then the US says, well, it's not my fault that you don't have a defense sector that can actually provide for expanded procurement needs, that you basically have been starving your own defense industries. And if you want to go through a real process of defense modernization, which much larger volumes of spending, your own sectors can't absorb that. The US isn't to blame for that either. I'm just kind of laying out on the table all the back and forth I've heard. But here's the bottom line from my point of view. So the real issue is that there's no defense requirements setting process across Europe. NATO regional defense plans are about as close as you can get to that. And it's an open-ended question whether or not they already assume a role for the United States in those defense plans because they were conceived under the previous administration that the US may no longer want to fulfill to that extent. The challenge you get is that you can't expect a whole bunch of different defense ministries to independently on their own come up with complementary capabilities and essentially procure that which they would need to be able to employ their force at scale. So bottom line is that without the United States, all these militaries together don't really add up right now for the ability to employ forces in any large-scale contingency on the continent.
So I think your point about will, I think the will in Europe is there.
Yeah.
But right now, it kind of reminds me of the movie Airplane. It's sort of a sea-level slapstick Leslie Nielsen comedy from the 1980s where there's a scene, and this is sort of how I imagine NATO as the stewardess, getting on the intercom and very calmly saying, is there anyone that knows how to fly a plane on board? And then the whole cabin just erupts in panic. And so I think Europe is the cabin right now. NATO is the stewardess and the American pilots are all off sick with food poisoning or whatever. But what strikes me is that this is an alliance built around the United States, as you said. So if we start to sort of imagine, we talk about the Russian timeframe. So let's just imagine it's 2030, 2029, whatever it is. And suddenly there's 150,000 Russian troops, just like as we saw around, on Ukraine's border, on the border of a Baltic state. And the United States has basically conveyed that it's not getting involved or not getting involved in a way that NATO expects it to get involved, right? NATO thinks the United States is going to fight the war. I mean, that's why we have a Joint Forces Command at Norfolk, which is to get U.S. stuff and U.S. personnel over to Europe. There's caves of equipment in Norway to equip U.S. forces. But let's just say, as Donald Trump said during the summer when at the NATO summit about Article 5 says, depends on your definition. Article 5 does not require the United States to actually go to war. And it's assumed that we would, but let's just say we're not. So we're not. How does Europe then congeal to, on its own, to stand up to that 150,000 Russian forces? So if you had to assess blue without the United States, what are some of the strengths? What are some of the weaknesses? Are there some strengths? And I think there are. Air power, the Nordics have air power coordinated. Now, they don't have all the enabling capabilities, but maybe you could assess how you would see that playing out in 2030. 150,000 Russian forces, no U.S., Europe needing to act.
Yeah, so the honest answer is not well. So first, European countries do have some command and control frameworks outside of NATO. For example, one of the derived ones are JEF, the Joint Expeditionary Force between the UK and Nordic countries. Another one that's being proposed right now by France for a security assurance force for Ukraine, which will involve a headquarters in France and another headquarters in Kiev. But these are for a much smaller number of forces and fairly low-end contingencies. Okay, these are not the kind of command and control schemes for a coalition of forces that one might employ against 150,000 Russian troops, all right, which is a fairly large-scale contingency. The first question is, okay, well, could European countries adapt and put this something together on their own? Yes, but initially not well, okay? One of the biggest defining features of successful modern military is the ability to employ forces and conduct complex operations at scale, and many militaries cannot do it. In fact, we saw the Russian military really struggled with this in the opening days of 2022. And this is very difficult to tell about a force, right? This is something the US can do fairly well. Israel can do it at a certain scale pretty well too. But oftentimes we look at manpower, we look at equipment, we look at exercise, but we don't actually know if that military can conduct any of this at scale, especially in their first attempt to do it on their own. Past experiences with European militaries in contingencies like Libya have not been great, I would say, as sort of signposts, but they were a long time ago. So it doesn't mean that Europe can't do much better. I think they would. Okay, when it comes to provision of logistics, intelligence, and these other things that one would need to prosecute a campaign, despite the air power advantage NATO have, there I think they would have issues. And here's the other part. There are lots of pockets of goodness around NATO. I think the main issue you'd run into is first a deficit of munitions, especially certain types of munitions. NATO has a huge advantage in air power, but largely for a fairly short conventional war. European militaries have not been good about securing magazine depth. Second, force capacity. So it's pretty small, and the deployability of those forces is a challenge for just NATO members to deploy across NATO member territories. You have countries with sizable forces that can mobilize a large reserve base like Finland, but they're primarily comprised of infantry battalions. They're not meant to help other forces, okay? And most NATO members that have a substantial reserve capacity are the ones that are likely to face Russia and border Russia. So they will largely mobilize this capacity to defend themselves. And the other NATO members, whether it's UK, France, Germany, they have the ability to deploy forces to the likely point of contact, to likely contingency, but not a lot, right? Especially early on. So if you take the United States largely out of this fight, then there are certainly, I think, big issues, especially if it's not a very short and sharp war. And by that, I mean it lasts more than a couple of days or a couple of weeks. So I don't want to sell, just to be clear, I don't want to sell European capability first. I want to be upfront, Max. You and I both know that I'm a Europhile. In fact, I'm getting on a plane to Brussels later today, and I spend on average, I don't know how much time I spend in Europe, but I'm in Europe at least twice a month, typically. So I am a big fan of the aspirational desire of Europeans to be able to do these things, but they are still quite a ways from it. Okay, and that's part of the issue we have. I think to a smaller end contingency, right? Like a very small operation by the Russian military, then it's not something Europeans could respond to. But even then, you will have a challenge, because in a small contingency that's likely to play out near the Russian borders, you may have a fairly small Russian military incursion, but it will likely be backed by a very large Russian force, okay, with a lot of Russian air defense and other capabilities on the Russian side of the border. And here, European ability to conduct the kind of operations that you see the United States doing, suppression, destruction of enemy air defense is a key component of air power and forced entry operations at scale with any amount of kind of sustainment behind it. That right now remains in question. So I think Europe has a lot of work to do.
I want to ask you sort of more conceptually about the concept of multilateral warfighting, where I guess, to be blunt, I don't quite get how NATO is supposed to work without the United States just sort of coming in and fighting. So you're going to have a collection of like 25 countries, all with sort of different kit and operating NATO standards, but that's a general sort of concept. And when I look at kind of the past big European wars, you know, you see a one concentrated force. You know, in World War I, it was Germany with the Schlieffen Plan, and it almost worked, but then the Brits decided to turn around, and you had the Miracle on the Marne. But, you know, there was all these problems between France and the UK in World War I, at least in the initial invasion. World War II, you know, Germany goes around the Maginot Line to invade, and there's a lack of Allied coordination. So I guess what I would be concerned about is also like how this is all supposed to gel in an integrated way on the European side, especially just when Europeans have been aiding Ukraine. Ukraine gets this zoo of equipment that is difficult because they have maybe some Italian trucks, some Finnish trucks. So, you know, stuff breaks down, especially in a prolonged war. I guess, how do you conceive of that? I mean, is that just like, there's some more issues, but they'll figure it out and it gets worked through? It's not a big problem. Or is this like Europeans would be looking at Russia and Russia would be looking at the other side of the line and say, oh, there's the Italians there, there's the Germans there. We can figure out seams and ways to move forward here.
So first, on the other side, the whole point of NATO is interoperability. It's the fact that these militaries should be able to work with a common operational plan and that they constantly exercise, right, across Europe in different contingencies to develop interoperability for its forces to work together. There's a degree of standardization in terms of equipment and munitions, although there a lot of things are not interchangeable as people wish they were. But interoperability, I think, to a substantial extent exists. The question is, could Europeans leverage that if the United States wasn't involved, making that effort cohesive and tying it together? And I think my honest answer is, to a limited extent, yes. It just depends on the scale. And then there would be a lot of growing pains. A lot of things would break. And let's be honest, a lot of things in real life are not like they were in exercises, okay? And I saw in 2022 and 2023, lots of folks in Western militaries kind of laughing at Russians not being able to do the things that NATO does in its exercises, which are completely unopposed, and everybody gets certified for their successful completion of the exercise, not realizing that actually none of them as a military have any experience of this in real life. Like crossing rivers is something nobody in NATO's probably done under fire in the existing memory of anybody in NATO, and like overcoming complex terrain, or there's a lot of things that people are looking at Russian force struggling with that NATO militaries would struggle with too. And also the scale of a lot of these exercises isn't very big as well on the NATO side. So even though they feature like a lot of troops, when you actually look at the force employment, it's not nearly that large. That would be my other kind of criticism. Okay, all that being said, I think there are huge positives and huge benefits to NATO, and NATO is very anomalous as an alliance. You're right. There's a reason for that as well. So typically what you see is two militaries that have a degree of interoperability, is ability to commonly plan and divide sectors up between them in a respective fight, like the British, let's say, in the French army in World War I, or in the opening days of World War II. But not requiring much interoperability beyond that. That's a sort of coalition you expect to see between major powers. I think one of the challenges you had after World War II is that the great powers of Europe were devastated. Okay, the US was not just a dominant military power, but it was so excessively dominant that then you had NATO essentially lead to an evolution of a lot of these militaries around the US armed forces. That's part of the reason what makes it anomalous, is the disproportionality of military power within NATO, where you have an alliance where one member actually brings so much of the defense spending and the capability to the alliance itself. Okay. And naturally, you ask the question, well, what goes to the alliance without the United States? So first, within NATO, you're always going to have coalitions, because in the event of any war with Russia, all right, you would expect some key players, and then you would expect sort of the Portugals of the alliance to basically say, I'm also with you, and here's a minesweeper or something. Like there would be the countries that were spending, like 1.2% of GDP or whatever it was on defense, looking at you, Spain, and a few other members whose primary security threat were migrants and whatnot. They obviously weren't going to contribute much to that fight, right, Max? So it was always going to be a coalition within NATO, because NATO expanded so much, right, and expanded to so many members. We're like, what's Montenegro going to be doing? Like this. Right. Okay, so that to me is unremarkable, that there was a real military coalition within NATO that was going to be engaged in military activity, and the rest will be playing supporting role. And their main contribution is the real estate, right? American, naval base on the road of Spain, for example, or something like that. Their main contribution is real estate, logistics, enabling the projection of U.S. military power in Europe. And that's what always concerned Russia the most. But one of the big challenges NATO has that, this old joke that, when the Russians said NATO, they typically meant the United States. And when Europeans said NATO, they often meant the United States as well. And when we hear Washington, D.C. say NATO, we mean Europeans, right? And so the challenge you get is that if you take the U.S. out of it, it's really not clear how much Russia would then be deterred by the collective military capability of NATO, and to what extent NATO could collectively exercise that military capability in a cohesive manner. And that's one of the biggest issues, because as long as the U.S. plays this leading role, you're probably not going to have NATO members invest in substitution for the U.S. It's a catch-22, right? And if the United States was suddenly to abandon this role, then you'd have a real gap in deterrence and defense within NATO, because it would take a while for NATO members to then figure out how to do this, who's going to lead. But it would still probably be within the NATO framework, because it's very hard to build any alternative security organization for Europe while you have NATO. Does that make sense? Like,
yeah.
NATO is so successful and so dominant, you don't see like all these fantasies of Euroforce. I'm sorry, I just don't believe in it.
Yeah, and it's got a really big, nice, shiny building, and it's there. I mean, I think the aspect of the military alliance that is unique is the organization part. And there is an organization part, as you mentioned, to organize things. And I guess this is the question then about Europeanizing NATO and whether that is possible. And the problem is that, like, as much as we're saying burden shifting, we're not actually really putting the pedal on the gas of Europeanizing. There's talk about transitioning SACEUR to European, which would have been, I think, very difficult to do. You know, that I think is one of the major challenges for Europe, that they're both being told to take responsibility, but then kind of being told not to. And so they're sort of stuck at 6s and 7s about what to actually do.
Look, I think the challenge I see for Europeans is the approach they've taken for the past year is just how you maintain the status quo. And that's been the European approach for a long time.
Oh, it's status quo is great.
Yeah, status quo is great. Yeah, I mean, listen, if you want to become a museum of geopolitics, then sure, status quo makes great sense. You just keep maintaining the status quo while other folks evolve and move forward. And then eventually, don't be surprised if folks are not so interested in your views in international affairs. But the reason I'm making this kind of critique is that the one thing that Europeans will not be able to maintain, it's very clear, is the status quo, because Russian military reconstitution is not an if, but a when. Okay. And changing US view on who should be responsible for the greater balance of managing security on the European continent is also been a fairly consistent secular trajectory in US strategy. All right. So both sides of these equations, you would think, should motivate European colleagues to understand that the one thing they will not be able to maintain is the status quo. Right? So change is inevitable. And change is almost inevitable. It's the safest bet. The safest bet you can make is the status quo will be fairly difficult to maintain. And so it's a conversation on how can European allies adapt to it and what are the right adaptations for them to make. And here I think you can get into a debate. Is the right adaptation to deter the Russian military, assuming a still fairly robust US role in Europe? Is the right adaptation substitution for US capabilities and what the US would provide, which would require perhaps a different set of expenditures and investments amongst European countries? Is that the right adaptation? Are you adapting to concerns about what the future US role might be? And then lastly, okay, also, how does Ukraine fit into the future of European security? Because invariably it does, right? And there's, I think, a real choice the European countries have to make on, do they provide some kind of security assurance force if that's part of a ceasefire, or do they focus primarily on their own defense and kind of leave Ukraine to whatever its fate might be after this agreement? Because strategy is about choices, right? You can't have everything. And, you know, if they choose to provide this force for Ukraine, it will most definitely impact their current commitments under NATO regional defense plans. You're not going to have both.
Mike, we could go on, and there's a lot more we'll have to talk about at the bar, but I want to thank you. This has been a tour de force going through both what to expect from Russia and what to expect from Europe going forward. I also want to do a quick plug for a report that we have out, How Europe Can Defend Itself with Less America, which offers some ideas of how Europe can think more creatively and try to think outside the box about what it needs to do to actually get ready for that potential, you know, waking up one morning and there's 150,000 Russians on the EU border. But Mike, thanks so much for joining us. And we're going to have you back here on the Eurofile as well as Russian Roulette sometime soon.
Thanks a lot, Max.
That's it for today's episode. As always, if you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. You may also be interested in our sister podcast, Russian Roulette, which covers the latest on Vladimir Putin's Russia and the ongoing war in Ukraine. Our thanks to our producers Shannon Young, Otto Svensson, and Lexi Linnefelter for coordinating and researching this episode. We'll be back soon with another assessment of Europe through a Washington lens. Until next time.